So, since it's Christmas, we are going to have a little talk about Jesus. And of course, there's so many scriptures about Jesus that we can't really look into all of them. And that is why I selected one scripture known as the Thomas Gospel, because it is actually very recently discovered. In 1945, it was discovered in Egypt. So it is quite original. It has not been changed by anybody since the time it was written, which is not really true for most of the more official Gospels of the Bible. It is interesting also because it is not even any kind of structured kind of scripture. It has 114 sayings said to be by Jesus. They always start with Jesus says this, Jesus said that. And these sayings, they come without any order. So one saying he's talking about this, the next saying he's talking about something completely different. So they didn't even bother to order it. So that's quite original, and the way it is written seems to indicate that it was written really as it happened. Like Jesus said something, and one of his disciples, Thomas, wrote it down. Or maybe afterwards, in the evening, wrote it down when he remembered it, or something like that. So it is quite an interesting document. And I'm really not any kind of specialist on the old scriptures of Jesus. I discovered this in America while visiting a friend there. He was showing it to me, and actually we stayed up most of the night talking about it. It was quite a revelation to find there a kind of philosophy, a view on life and on spirituality, which was very similar to the one we find in yoga. And so that is why it is interesting to have a look at it, because, most of us have had some Christian background. I quite fondly remember my teacher of religion when I was a child. She was an old lady, and she would talk about Jesus, all these stories, and she had little prayer cards which would show, Jesus doing this or that. And so I have a really nice connection to that. And then, of course, afterwards, this connection became a little bit troublesome, because then you start understanding that, the least one can say is that many have wrongly used whatever Jesus has been bringing. I really don't want to go into that today. I mean, it's Christmas, So it's obvious, you find it in any culture, in any spiritual movement, in any kind of religion, that people also misunderstand and misuse. This happens everywhere, and people start then fighting about whoever has the right, understanding, whoever's God is the real God, and things like that. This is all pretty stupid, but to be expected, because the ego also is everywhere. Not only God is everywhere, but the ego also is everywhere. So then you have, many Christians having disagreements, but also you find that in Hinduism, that Shaivite sadhus may fight with Vaishnavite sadhus. You may find it in Buddhism that the red hat monks, they fight with the black hat monks. And you obviously also find it in the Muslim religion. So it's just everywhere. So let's not just look at that. Let's just try to find the original teaching and see what we can learn from it. And in that way, a little bit like maybe resolve this issue that we have with religion by seeing that, the original was really quite nice and quite right and quite interesting, and so much corresponding to all these other scriptures that we are mostly using in yoga. So I could here maybe this evening give a lecture using Bhagavad Gita, another famous Hindu scripture, and then explain what is said there. Or I could take some of the Upanishads, which are even a little more clear, or I could take the Thomas Gospel. It doesn't really matter, it's really quite the same. Although, one difference which is there is that Jesus is more talking in riddles. He's telling stories, and he's not making it so easy. And there's many reasons for that, probably. I mean, obviously Jesus had a little issue with the Pharisees, the priests of Jewish society, who in the end even, made the Romans crucify him. So he had to be a little bit careful about what he was saying. And also, as it was in many of the old cultures, there was the feeling that such deep spiritual knowledge should not be offered too freely, should be made a little difficult to understand, so that only the ones who are ready to understand can understand it. This is maybe not so much the opinion of today, but you find that also in old Hindu scriptures, for example. So we have to a little bit go through these riddles, find the answers there. And for me, this was so surprising that actually it was quite easy to find the answers and to see the meaning of the symbolism. I may be wrong in some occasions, I'm really not a specialist on Jewish culture, because of course some of these symbols are belonging to Jewish culture. But I believe you will all find that is relatively easy to understand. And then that does not mean that there cannot be a second meaning to these riddles or phrases, a more maybe mysterious, esoteric meaning. I'm not really looking for that this evening. I'm just trying to understand what is he saying. And already that is quite nice. And sure, for that we don't really have to go to the Thomas Gospel alone. Even if you take the Bible, many things there are quite obvious and also obviously misunderstood in the way that the church has been living with these teachings. Like, just to make one example, Jesus is said to be the Son of God, and in the church's opinion, he is the only Son of God. There have been many, debates and fights about that subject. But then in the Bible, quite clearly, you have Jesus himself saying, "Dear brothers and sisters, I am the Son of God." But if he is saying, "Dear brothers and sisters, I am the Son of God," then obviously we are all sons and daughters of God. He does not make any difference between himself and us. So this is just one example. You will find this in the Common Bible. But so in the Thomas Gospel, you find quite a lot of clarity, and we can't really go through all the 114 sayings. That would take us far too much. So I've made a little bit of a selection and grouped them a little bit according to subject. And anybody who likes to really read it all can find it also in the internet. If you type Thomas Gospel Yoga or something like that in Google, you will easily find it. It's all the texts, original texts are there, as well as my own interpretation of it. So, the first subject that we encounter is Maya, illusion, the very essential concept in yoga. To say that this whole world is nothing but an illusion. It is not real. That which we experience through the senses is not real, or at least relatively unreal. So then that also actually we find with Jesus, and he actually uses very much the same kind of reasoning. For example, here he says, "Whoever has come to know the world has discovered a carcass, a dead body. And whoever has discovered this carcass, of that person the world is not worthy." So what is he saying? He's saying, well, if you look at the world, whatever you are seeing soon will perish, soon will die, soon will go. It is impermanent. And in that way, it is an illusion. That is a very essential yogic idea, that whatever is real cannot just stop to exist. Whatever is real must stay. And whatever just seems to be there, but then 1 moment later is gone, is an illusion. Like in the desert, sometimes you can see some trees or something, and then you look again and it is gone, like a mirage. So this is also true of this world. Things stay around a little bit longer than the mirages in the desert, but still, whatever is there, whatever you can attach yourself to in this world, soon will go. So that is an illusion or only relatively real. It obviously has some reality. It is not ultimately or absolutely real. So, and once you understand that, then of that person the world is not worthy, of that, world you are no longer interested, or not so much interested. You understand that whatever you can find there, anyhow, is not so essential. It's not really the ultimate goal. So it is actually quite clear. And so he goes on in another saying, in a similar way. He says, this heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away. It's actually quite interesting also that he is talking about more than one heaven, which is also in Hinduism. They actually have 7 heavens. But so quite clearly, even that will go. Even beyond the physical world, that which is there beyond, even that will go. That is still all world of names and forms. And then he says an interesting phrase, the dead are not alive, and the living will not die. Which is quite a riddle-like, but easy to solve. The dead are not alive. Well, that's obvious, right? The dead are not alive. Yeah, sure, that's right. And then he says, the living will not die. That is quite strange. How can it be that the living will not die? So, well, obviously, that which really lives is not the body. That which really lives, truly lives, eternally lives, is the self, is pure consciousness, cosmic consciousness, or however you want to call it. And so that will not die. And that also means that the dead are not alive, meaning that the body, which is dead, is really not alive. So, and then he says, during the days when you ate what is dead, you made it come alive. And it's also quite interesting to eat what is dead, and by that way make it come alive. That means that you, which is not the you like in Peter Marchand you, but which is the essential you, the self, makes the body come alive, right? And in that way eats it, consumes it, which of course it does. We are using this body, we are consuming it. And because of us being there, it lives and then dies. And then he goes on and says, when you are in the light, what will you do? On the day when you were one, you became two. When you become two, what will you do? A little bit more riddle here. But so he is saying, on the day when you were one, you became two. Now, that you can also very easily find in Vedic scripture. The idea that the one, cosmic consciousness, at some point became two. In Vedic scripture, they say he got a little bored, the guy, after a million years of being God and pure bliss and everything, but nothing going on, he, made himself into the two basic opposites of energy and consciousness, and from there the whole universe was created. So, if you become one, then you will become two. But then when you find yourself being two, being in duality, then what will you do? Again, you will try to become one. So the whole game of life is shown as a movement from one to two and back from two to one. And again, if you want. Right? So this is a very similar view as we find it in Vedic scripture. And then a little going on about the basic immortality of the self. He says, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. He is not saying will not die. He's saying will not taste death. So once you really discover the truth of what he is teaching, once you really discover the self, because discovering the truth of what he is teaching is not like about understanding it intellectually, it's about really discovering yourself. No? So when you are really identified with the self, then you may still die, but you will not taste it. You will not experience it. It will be not to you a death. It will be just a passing phase, a change of garments. So, and then another subject which comes up related to it is the unborn self. Very often in India, the self is named the unborn. So he says, when you see one who was not born of woman, fall on your faces and worship. This is very, very clear. The self is not born, it is self-existent. It does not come from anywhere, it does not go anywhere, it always is. And then here the disciples ask some question of Jesus, and they ask him, tell us, how will our end come? And Jesus says, have you found the beginning then, that you are looking for the end? The end will be where the beginning is. Congratulations to the one who stands at the beginning. That one will know the end and will not taste death. So here the end and the beginning are the same. That from where you start is that where eventually you will end up. If you can stand there at the start, then you can play the whole game without tasting any death, because you know you are the end, you are the beginning, you are eternity. So this is all about the eternal self, the immortality of the self. So, and then how to discover this truth, the supreme, within the illusion, where to find. And Jesus says, I am the light that is over all things. I am all, from me all came forth, and to me all attained. So there he is quite clearly said, I, this is not Jesus talking actually, no, this is the self talking. I am the light. No? Consciousness is the light. This is that which sheds the light. No? That is in all things. No? So I am everything, and from me everything has come, and to me everything will come back. No? You will not find me in a house of wood and stone. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone and you will find me. So it is not in the form that you can find it. You have to go beyond the form, you have to look beyond the form, and there you will find the self. And then there's a little discussion which still is very much like happening today. The chicken or the egg question. What came first? Did consciousness evolve out of the body, as most scientists here believe, and actually most people here believe? Is it just like some byproduct of the body? Or is it the other way around? Did the body and this whole universe evolve from consciousness? So then Jesus says, if the flesh came into being because of the spirit, that is a marvel. But if spirit came into being because of the body, that is a marvel of marvels. So what is he saying? If the flesh came into being because of the spirit, he says, well, that is something really quite fantastic or wonderful, difficult to really understand. But if spirit came into being because of the flesh, because of the body, that is a marvel of marvels. A marvel of marvels is like something which is like too marvelous to believe. It's almost impossible. No? So he's not really saying it's either this or that, but he's quite clearly saying, okay, what kind of miracle you want, right? To have something beautiful as the self evolve from the flesh, just from matter, that is like impossible, almost too good to be true. The other miracle, that out of the spirit, out of consciousness, out of the self, the body came, is much more easy to accept. And you will also find that later when he talks about the wealth, very often he describes the self and the knowledge of the self as a true wealth, right? And the body as being very poor. So, and then, which was something quite surprising to me, also he makes some very clear references to the division between energy and consciousness, which is, even in Vedic scripture, you have to really look well to find that. It's a little bit almost like a tantric point of view. So, for example, he tells his students how to go into the world and teach and all these things. And he says, if they ask you, what is the evidence of your Father in you? Then say to them, it is motion and rest. No, that is very, very great. And people want to know, how come this God, is in you? This God is in me because in me I find motion and rest. Energy and consciousness. Energy is always moving. Energy never stops. Energy is always changing, and in that way never changes. Because it's always changing, while consciousness never changes. And in that way is never changing. And both are the only ones that are therefore eternal. And can be seen as the ultimate duality out of which the Supreme is made. The Supreme being the Father. So, quite clear, he is here referring to that. And then there is another saying which is also on the same subject, and which I'm sure some feminists will not like, but they also have to a little bit understand the time, and the position of women at that time. And there's a little story really that Saint Peter, said to Jesus, please make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life. Life meaning, the real life, the self, that one, which is unborn and never dying. So he's a little bit like a chauvinist pig or something, like he doesn't want the ladies around. He thinks this is only for the males. And then Jesus says, well, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. And now, you are thinking, well, Jesus also is really like a little bit chauvinistic pig, but not really. I mean, he doesn't really want to have a fight, with Peter. But he says something which also you will find in Scripture. In Scripture, it is quite clearly said that the Supreme is made out of consciousness and energy. And then consciousness very often is named male and energy named female. That's just, because, well, you can reason about that, but that's just a way of, giving things a name, right? Shiva and Shakti. So then consciousness is Shiva, is male. And quite clearly, the path in yoga requires first that you withdraw to Shiva, meaning that you go inside to consciousness, and that you do not look at the energy, because the energy is always changing, so you can't really, get any peace there. First, you need to go inside, find the self as pure consciousness. Only then to realize that on the other half of this pure consciousness, there is also pure energy, and that from this energy also everything comes forth, and then, you can again move out, and then you start working also with the energy side of things. But so, in the path, the yogic path, quite clearly the first step is to go inside to the male side. So that is what he is saying. He is saying, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too can become a living spirit, the self, that she can become the self, resembling you male. So he's not even saying that the self is male, he's just saying that, okay, there's a little resemblance between the self and what could be called male. So for every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven, obviously a name given for enlightenment. This is very clear in Jesus' scriptures that the kingdom of heaven is not something you reach after dying. It's something you reach on earth. So then what else can it be, heaven on earth? That is enlightenment, right? So he could have said here, to please the females, that every male who makes himself female also will enter the kingdom of heaven, because of course ultimately enlightenment means that Shiva and Shakti come together again, and that there is no more opposition between consciousness and energy, that they really become one. But well, maybe he didn't want to upset the males too much or something, and the females usually they can take a lot, they're the strong sex. So that's more or less how I would interpret that part. Of course, Jesus also talks about the ego, right? So he says, damn the soul that depends on the flesh. Damn the soul that depends on the flesh. Who is the soul who depends on the flesh? That is the ego. The one who identifies with the body. No? Because the ego is nothing but an idea. It is a reflection of the self in the intellect, in the whole body of ideas of I am this body. No? But truly the ego and the self are actually one and the same. No? Only, looking a little bit from a different side of things. But they are the same. When you say I, you mean both I as the self and I as the ego. No? And to really make peace between those two, that's the trick. No? So anyhow, if the soul depends on the flesh for its existence, if it identifies with the flesh, then it is damned. Then it, cannot have any happiness or anything like that. And then he also says, damn the flesh that depends on the soul. And that is, of course, also another warning. The ego should not expect spirituality to serve its purposes. Which you find often enough in people who are a little bit like in the beginning of spirituality. They believe, they will get a lot out of it for their ego. Like maybe status, they can say, oh, I'm a yogi, this kind of thing. So also in that way, there should be no dependence. So there's a little bit about his view on things, and then he also gives many guidelines, like on the path of yoga or spirituality. And first of all, of course, there is perseverance. He says those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. This is obviously quite clear. When they find, they will be disturbed. And when they are disturbed, then they will marvel. So this is quite typical also. You cannot seriously enter the game of spirituality without being a little bit disturbed by it. This is quite a confrontation. You are, finally getting to know the ego. No? I once gave a class, Hello, Mr. Ego. And like 1 week later, one person who attended this class came back to me and said, you ruined my life. Before all these things I was doing, I was not, aware of it. It just was happening. And now, after this class of you, I see myself. I can't stand myself. So, quite clearly, there is quite a confrontation. So in the beginning you are disturbed. And then he says, but if you really are disturbed, then in the end you will marvel. Then in the end you will pass through that. And you will really, get closer to the self. And then he says, and then you will reign over all. And that comes in many other sayings also, that he says, when you have found that, then you are the one who can lead others. And who also has to lead others. It's quite clear in his statements that part of the journey requires that you pass on what you have learned to others. And then he says, and after they have reigned, then they will rest. So, after doing that for a while, after fulfilling that duty, the duty to the teacher, as it is called in India, the duty to pass on the teachings to others, then you will really benefit from it. Then you will really find the peace. So if you're wondering why I'm teaching, that's why I'm teaching. Right. And then another aspect which he touches upon is this. Look to the living one as long as you live. Otherwise, you might die and then try to see the living one. And you will be unable to see. And this is also very interesting. One of the great opportunities for enlightenment comes at death. It's not a requirement, but it's very often that it comes at death. Because when you die, you leave this body, so then a lot of the attachments, they are going anyhow. A lot of the illusion is dropping anyhow. So if then already during your life you really have been focusing on the self, you have been living a spiritual life, then it will be much more easy to at that point really drop everything else, all that is still remaining in your soul of whatever dreams, frustrations, desires, all these things, drop it and really merge with the self. While if you have not done that, if you have not been living a spiritual life, then every death will, just be a waste. You will waste the opportunity, because then you will be so far away from it that you cannot really merge into the self. The Father's kingdom is like a merchant who had a supply of merchandise and found a pearl. That merchant was prudent. He sold the merchandise and kept the single pearl for himself. So also with you, seek this treasure that is unfailing, that is enduring, where no moth comes to eat and no worm destroys. So this is a little bit more like before, to focus on that which does not perish, which does not go, to focus on that which always remains there. And one who seeks will find, and for the one who knocks, the door will be open. And this tells you a little bit that little humbleness also is required. Not too much, that's just a little ego game also, but a little humbleness is really required for the door to be opened. Humbleness. For the door to be opened, for the door to the self to be opened. And so don't, shout and, bang hard on the door, it's like, don't try to knock the door in, Don't try to force it. Just be humble, follow the path, and then at some point the door is open and self is waiting for you there with open arms. I will give you what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, and what has not arisen in the human heart. So you have to look beyond your senses. This is not something you can see. This is not something you can hear. This is not something you can touch. This is not even something you can feel. Like, has not arisen in the human heart. This is not on the level of the emotion. This is going way beyond mind, beyond the senses. There you can find the truth.